doing is getting as much renewable energy into the buildings in the city. And it's done that by actually two programs. One's called MREP, and that's the Melbourne Renewable Energy Program. We've been building wind farms. We built two, and all the partners of the people you can see there, Aussie Post, RMIT, I suspect Monash might be there somewhere. You see Beacon. Basically, we said, you give us your money, we'll build a wind farm, and you can then use that energy and say you're going net zero. And so, two things about that are important. One is you're not actually sequestering your energy off in some forest in Indonesia that you're never going to see. You're doing it locally, and that's important. People can go out and see where you're actually generating stuff. But you can start to actually move the city to net zero. What opened 2 weeks ago were community batteries. So we're now putting batteries into the city and collecting the energy locally, usually when it's at low prices during the morning so people can use it later on when it's more expensive. It can also support the grid. Why are these things important? Because I was at the World Economic Forum between 2008 and 2020, and they used to talk about climate change. And I said, you can't just talk about climate change. It's too big a concept for people to get their heads around. If climate change is a problem, it's a different problem if it's in a rural area than in a city. So what do you do in a city? What does climate change in a city mean? And suddenly all the things I've been talking about drop out. You can plant forests, you can walk, you can change the vehicles, you can build localized batteries, etc. So we've got to start giving the community a narrative that they can actually grab hold of and be part of, rather than saying governments are going to sort it out, because I can tell you governments are not going to sort it out. Partnerships. One of the most important things of the 40 years was the partnerships. I wrote a book a few years ago, and I called it Urban Choreography. I wrote it with Kim Dovey and Ron Jones. And they said, why urban choreography? And I said, well, that's really all we do. We take everybody's good ideas and we put them together and then show people or help people to make them happen. And that's what we need to do to, in fact, make cities better. And we had a whole lot of partnerships where we used other people's money to make the city better. And I haven't got time to talk about all of those, but I'll talk about one of them. Next time you go into the city, you go to Queen Victoria Market, you go across the road from the Dairy Hall, there's a new development there called the Munro. The Munro development does a number of things. It's got 500 cars in the basement, which means that whole car park at Queen Victoria Market is about to go to an open space. It will be Melbourne's largest public open space. Melbourne was never designed with squares. It was actually designed with markets. It had 4 or 5 markets. But we never had a major square. So that car park is going to go to a public square. It's the biggest one in the central city. And the way we did that was to say, well, we'll put 500 cars in the basement right opposite the dairy hall so you're closer. We also wanted community facilities. So we've got a new library that's gone there. We've got maternal and health care and all those things that the community expects to find where they live. And that's quite a high density area of Melbourne. We also put in 15% affordable housing. Governments are talking about 5%. 5% will just not do it. In places like Canada and the UK, they do 50%. We've been doing 15% and there's affordable housing. So there are a whole lot of other things that we did there. There's a hotel, the residential is built for rent. The way that stacks up, and you can't read it from here, is that you buy the site, you then have to pay for the community facilities, and then you look at all the things you get back. You had to build community facilities anyway, so you can take some of those off. Some of our community facilities closed because they were subpar, and we were bringing them into Queen Victoria so we could actually sell that land off. We actually got residual value back from the developer who we sold the strata title to the blue stuff that you can see there. We had a residual value ourselves of the property that remained. And then we got to the value of the open space, and the value of the open space was $100 million. And that's what actually makes these things stack up. The local government needs to get some benefit out of projects like this that developers don't have to get. And so you can make that stack up for all parties, and you can design it in a way that it has lanes and arcades, and it has active frontages, there are no blank backs, And all of that happens right opposite the Queen Victoria Market, which is trying to shift into the 21st century without spoiling the character of that market. And I can tell you that's a really difficult thing to do, because the nature of the Queen Victoria Market is open sheds without a lot of facilities. So slowly facilities are being provided. The roof that's gone on is insulated now. It's got solar panels on it. That help the structure because it actually put more weight on. All of these things started to work towards making a better place. So what does that all mean? There are two Melbournes. I've been talking about that Melbourne. There's this other Melbourne, which spreads out to the horizon. And how do you take the lessons we've been talking about here to that broader metro area? What happens is the state government, every time it's got a problem, says we're just going to build affordable housing on the fringe. I can tell you that that housing is not affordable. The land might be affordable and the house package might be affordable, but living there is not affordable. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Griffith University back in 2001 and 2006 did a study called the Vampire Study, and that's vulnerability of people living in certain areas to mortgage and petrol prices. And you can see it was getting worse. It was more red and orange when you get to 2006. Every capital city in Australia. So building on the fringe is actually not a good solution for a whole lot of reasons. It's not a walkable solution because most of those people who live out of that central city need to in fact own cars to get around. Whenever you get some stress in the market, you look at the houses that start to fail to pay their mortgages, and a lot of those are on the fringe. It's also not a good thing in terms of family well-being. And a lot of the violence that you get, family violence, starts to distribute itself quite interestingly also. And you can imagine the frustration if you spend 2 hours driving from work to get home, and your partner's most probably being at home without a car trying to make things work. That those things can lead to sort of stresses that lead to family violence. I'm not saying it's the only thing, but there are some patterns emerging here. Then you start to look at health, and again the same thing happens. If you drive a car from the suburbs to the city and park it, you're mostly just walking for 7 minutes in the day. If you use public transport, you're walking for about 40 minutes a day. RMIT, Billy Giles Corte, said you're more likely to have a heart attack if you live in the suburbs than if you live in the central city, because you're not walking. And the myth of the cheap fringe is actually blown apart here, where the Automobile Association of Australia, back in February 22, said the cost of running a car, if you buy a house in the fringe, you need to then buy a car, was costing you $22,400 per annum. Two-car family, that's $44,000. The average salary on the fringe is $47,000 to $57,000. That formula doesn't work. How do you actually look at this, and what does it mean? I was born in Zimbabwe. I went to university in Cape Town. The campus was a beautiful campus on the side of Table Mountain. And when I went there in 1969 as a fourth-year student, I travelled around Europe, and the baby boomers had hit the system, and every university was expanding. I went back to do my thesis, and there was only one site left on the campus. It's that black hole up there. And I wanted to do an art college, and I went to get some data on it, and I said, by the way, what are you going to do to expand the university? Because all the universities overseas are expanding. And they said, we've asked a different question. The question we've asked is, how well are we using the stuff that we've got? And what showed up was they were using lecture theatres for 17.5% of the day. For the rest of the day, they were lying empty. Yet every faculty said they wanted more lecture theatres. So they said, we just read timetable. I was invited back 40 years later to have a talk, and they built that one site up there. They trebled their student population. And what I noticed was the campus was absolutely vibrant from early morning till late evening. It was a place, a real pleasure to be in, because there was this buzz about it of people and education and learning and knowledge. And the question that rose to me is, if you can do that with a campus, why can't you do that with a city? So I came back to Melbourne and convinced Jim Betts and the Department of Transport to give me a little bit of money, and we did a study which actually looked at what happens if you put your population where your public transport is. If you put it around activity centres, you could get about 86,000 people living in activity centres. And the metrics behind that is you're using 60% of the land there and you're building no higher than 5 to 8 stories. You do not have to build high buildings to get high density. So you get just short of 1 million people living in activity centres. Why is that important? Because we haven't got 10 activity centres, as the current state government is arguing that they'll upgrade 10 activity centres. We've got 120. Every railway station is in fact a small activity centre, and all of those need to increase their density to a certain extent. The interesting thing is if you jump up in a helicopter, and this is the next one we'll look at, it's very easy to draw a line around activity centres or a transport corridor and not invade the residential population. And I'll come back to that. So the next thing we looked at is road-based public transport. What if we actually allowed reasonably high development, 5 to 8 stories, just along the tram and bus corridors? Not 100 metres back, but just those properties facing the tram and bus corridors. And what we found is that you have a very good system. You have radial transport systems, you have trains and trams, and you have a gridded bus road system with buses. So that can work as a really excellent transport system if you coordinate. And so we started to go through and do the metrics on how many parcels of land would you get along those corridors. And we took out all the sensitivities. So we first of all identified them, we took out activity centres because we already measured those, and we started to take out things like parks, etc. And you can slowly see the number down the bottom getting smaller. I won't read out each one. Rear landways, because you didn't want big black holes to car parks off your main street. Recently developed sites, heritage registered buildings, heritage overlay areas, take out 50% of the capacity because you can build in heritage overlay areas, but you have to be sensitive about how you do it. And small blocks of 6 metres we took out. And what you ended up with is a number of parcels that could be developed. And at levels of 5 to 8 stories, you could get 2.4 million people living just along those corridors. So what does that mean for a city like this? And that was 3% of the metro area. The activity centres were 3%. And we also looked at brownfield sites with 1.5%. So these are the corridors. That's Nicholson Street. You can see the city in the background there. You can see the expensive infrastructure, which is the tram line. You can see the nature of the development that was there. So what if just those ones facing could go to 5 to 8 stories? And this was a diagram we did. This is in fact what's happening. It's not become planning policy, but in fact the developers have worked out that it's actually not a bad place to live. And some of the people living in these areas have realised it's not a bad place to in fact have development, so that you can have people buying in the shops, using the restaurants, and actually making the area vital. And you don't have to knock down the fabric to make it happen. These things can set back from the street so you still get sun and light into it. And some of those are of a reasonable quality. You also can have some that are quite small. There's a little one there with a green veranda. It's got a density of 200 people per hectare. You cannot see it from the street when you're 20, 30, 50 metres down. That's it there. It steps back. It's got a number. It's got 14 residential units in it. And it actually fits into, that's in Brunswick Street, very well. This is actually social housing. It used to be an open lot car park. It's now got social housing, it's still got the parking on the first level, which I'll show you in a second. It's got municipal offices, it's got a supermarket, it's got childcare. What is better, an open lot car park or mixed-use development that gives all of that to the communities? This is it from above, so you can actually see the car parking there. You can see its proximity to tram network, so those people now have an address on Brunswick Street. So instead of being part of an estate, they're part of a road and a community, and you've reinstated that connection with the neighbourhood character. That is so important, that people actually feel part of a neighbourhood, not part of a slightly isolated area. The last 1.5%, as I said, was those brownfield sites, Scotland's being one of them. So what have we been talking about? We've been talking about a city like this that has tram corridors. You might need to add a few. You build along those corridors and in your brownfield sites. You don't invade the areas in between. In fact, those areas in between become your new green belt. That's where people plant trees, collect water, put solar panels on their roofs, and actually add to the green wedges of our city. How do you identify those? You can see, as you climb up in a helicopter, you can see a different fabric here, where you've got a tram line. It looks a bit like that. It's not huge areas, it's those areas along those corridors. We tested it on Swanson Street. Unfortunately, we wanted to go 8 stories, but government allowed higher development, it got slightly higher. And you drop straight back down to 2 or 3 stories behind it. You can get the planning scheme on one page, because there's not a lot you have to get people to actually do. So this is a way of actually looking at designing better cities. And emerging at the moment is new technology. I chair a group out of Western Australia that's actually imported 2 trackless trams from China. It's a tram that follows a white line. It doesn't have any tracks, it runs on batteries, as you can see on the roof. It's got no overhead wires. It costs about 1/10 of the cost of a normal tram system. So you can start to create corridors and put development there and not actually invade the areas. What does a corridor look like? This is Elizabeth Street. You can see the 5 to 8 stories coming in. How does it change the local area? That's the part of Carlton. Right off to the left-hand side, you can just see a tram sticking its nose through. What does it look like when you left it? You planted some trees, you put some medians in the road, you put 5 to 8 stories. We're not talking about changing areas dramatically. We're talking about incremental change. It's more like keyhole surgery than open heart surgery, which is what is being advocated at the moment. I take you back to this. Recently, that study we did in 2010, we went back and said, how have things changed? This is the 96 tram route. This was just done a few weeks ago. And we went back to the corridor. So along that corridor, these are the properties that face onto that corridor. And we started to take out the sensitivities again, the parks, etc. And I won't read them out. What did that leave us? Once we'd taken out all the sensitivities, 95,950 square meters of developable land. That is 6,000 residential units in 4.3 kilometers of Nicholson Street. That is where we can go, and that's where I think we should be going. When you talk about the metrics around this, on 3% of the land, you can get 2.4 million people. Between 2010 and 2021, 55,000 units were built without any government policy around that, along those tram corridors. So what happens if you put government policy in place that says those are going to be our areas of transition, just those areas, 3% of the metro area, and we'll give good guidelines and go code compliant so that we don't have to, in fact, wait for development to happen, we can facilitate it. And we pick up half the uplift on that property and reinvest it back in the community. That would be a planning scheme that would actually work, unlike the one that I think we've got at the moment. The metrics around the 7.5% city, which is the one I showed you before, is that you could actually accommodate another 5 million people. You didn't have to go higher than 5 to 8 stories. And you saved $550 billion in infrastructure costs, because the infrastructure was already, most of it, there. You've got a problem, and the problem is one of trust. The community no longer trusts the planning process, because it keeps on delivering stuff that they didn't think they were going to get, and they don't like when they see it. How do you fix that trust? You could actually look at a planning scheme, and you could say, if you gave people certainty about what development they were getting where, they might actually start to trust you. And I think there are only 3 areas in the city, not 76 zones as you get in the planning scheme. The areas of maturity, they are older areas, they've got heritage in them, they're areas that don't need to change much, and people don't want them to change much. They make up about 92% of our city. The areas of transition which we should change. They're the areas close to our public transport, and they make up 7.5% if we include our activity centres, etc. And we can get all the population we need for the next 50 years into those areas. And then there are new development areas. And I'm not sure where those are, but I know they're not on the fringe.